prepared, you may make your opening statement.
Thank you. Councils, ladies and gentlemen, Judge, ladies and gentlemen of the panel, thank you, first of all, for all your service. Can everybody hear me very well so far? This will be several days. There'll be a lot of difficult and some emotional testimony, and I just wanted to thank you in advance for the time and effort and attention you're going to put in this case. This case has a lot of moving parts, and so though the judge has asked that it be brief in his discussion with you, I fear that I need to cover a number of things with you, so I'm going to take the time that I believe that the evidence demands to try to give you a roadmap as to what I believe you will hear in terms of evidence in this case. I start with what I understand Sadie Beecham will share with you. Sadie Beecham, I think, will tell you that on May 17th, 2020, she felt her life was finally about to change. She had lived with the defendant last in 2012. So this was 8 years later since she had last lived with him on a regular basis. They had 3 children together. She will tell you that he basically came and went as he pleased. He had a different household. He did not pay her living expenses or her children's on any kind of regular basis. Sometimes he showed up on weekends, and yet he expected and anticipated that they were in a relationship and that simply was going to be enough. In December of 2018, she didn't want to live that way anymore. And so for a variety of reasons, they broke up. And so that relationship, that separate houses, you come when you want, when you mess up, you just beg me for forgiveness or do a gesture that tries to get the same situation where you're always in control, was going to be over. And so for a few weeks, they didn't have any contact. And then slowly but surely, the defendant wanted to have visits with his kids, which of course was fine with her, and he was able to get back in touch with her on a regular basis, trying to get back together with her, again trying the cycle of trying to get forgiveness and everything will change. But this time she wasn't going there. It doesn't mean she wasn't nice to him. Doesn't mean there weren't times where she tried out of kindness to explain why this relationship was not happening. Doesn't mean she didn't have feelings for him in some way, shape, or form based on their history. But she was ready to move on. And by February 17th of 2020, she was on a dating site, and she met somebody where she thought maybe this will go somewhere. The person she was in contact with was Rosalio Gutierrez. Now, he was from Kenosha, so there was that was a drive to sort of see what she was going to be able to make of this. But he seemed to love his kids and to have a relationship with his kids, and she liked that it might go somewhere. Now, this is the early weeks of this maybe relationship, right? It's not exclusive. And so she doesn't feel like she wants to share that yet with her 11-year-old who turns 12. And she certainly doesn't want to share it with the defendant, who is her ex. She knows him, and she is right in the sense that what I'm going to talk about next in the evidence, I'm going to ask you to look for a certain pattern. I'm going to ask you to consider whether the defendant, as I outline the next grouping of incidents, is an individual who shows by each of these incidents that he is overwhelmed with jealousy. You'll hear a number of communications where that is clear even from his own mouth. And that he has an overwhelming need in that jealousy to be in absolute control when it comes to Satan. Each of these incidences can be characterized as a gesture where he demands control, and as he loses control, we'll talk about what the evidence shows comes next. More and more irrational each time, more and more disturbing. And then I'm going to ask you to take a look at whether the defendant in each of these incidences shows you his determination to have absolute control by using every tool available. Using human spies, a person named Steve Lentz, he texts as a lookout for him, his own daughter, age 11 and 12, will tell you I was recruited by him as essentially a spy. And that he's willing to use electronics too. Basically, every way you can spy on another individual, the defendant was employing in regards to Sadie Beecham. So let's talk about each of those incidences briefly. April 24th, and this is just a 1-month period where the defendant slowly but surely learns no matter how he imposes himself, he will not get control. And so what culminates at the end of that about a month-long period is Rosalio Gutierrez no longer being alive to anybody who cares about him, to anybody who knows him. So I start with April 24th. The defendant has his 3 children with Sadie at his house. So he has his 11-year-old daughter, whose birthday is going to be the next day, and his 2 4-year-old twins at his home. As he is the only adult there. Sadie does not have the kids on that day. So what Sadie does is invites her new relationship, Rosalio, to come over to her home. She has no children there. She's a consenting adult whose children are at their father's. She invites Rosalio to her home. In the middle of the night, she's awoken. She's awoken because her doorbell rings. She looks out and she sees a vehicle that looks like a vehicle that the defendant owns squealing away. The next day, Rosalio and her discover that Rosalio's truck has been entered. A letter has been taken from that truck, as well as his car registration, a registration that has his stepfather's name signed on it as the person who signed, I believe, the title, the registration. That's missing from Rosalio's truck that was parked at Sadie's home. The 11-year-old daughter then, by the time police talk to her, she is 12, says that in the middle of the night, she went with her father to the home of her mother, who she normally lives with, Sadie, that her father peeks in the windows at that location. The daughter says the two twins, age 4, are left at his house unsupervised. She actually says, I didn't feel that was safe. She says her father, the defendant, gets the paperwork out of this person's truck. She says her father, the defendant, takes a listening device and puts it in a vent at her mother's home. She says that he summons her over, and she is encouraged to look inside the window of her mother's home. And at that time, she sees her mother and a person she's never met, she hasn't seen before, who she now believes to be Rosalio, in that, I believe, living room of her house through the window. Her father's instructions are, be sure you don't steam the window up because they might be able to see it. This is the middle of the night for an 11-year-old girl the day before her birthday, when a rational mind might be making sure everybody had a really good night's sleep, anticipating a party or a celebration the next day. This is how the defendant chooses to conduct himself. He admits to law enforcement that he had a premonition that something was going on over there, and not only does he admit he went there, but he admits that he encouraged or helped his daughter look in that window. He denies that he put a listening device in. He denies he left the 4-year-old twins behind. He says he brought them along in the middle of the night. Rang the doorbell, needing to show in a gesture, I'm still in control. You'll hear that in the defendant's phone, when law enforcement apprehend him, in his phone, they find a screenshot that has a section of the registration of Rosalio Gutierrez on it. It has the signature section for the person who is Rosalio Gutierrez's stepfather. And in handwriting, which the daughter will tell you is my father's handwriting, it has Rosalio Gutierrez's home Kenosha address written down. Now, the event I've told you about on April 24th occurs at Sadie's home. The defendant, of course, knows Sadie's home, right? He's been there in the context of the children, etc. This is new. This is information about Rosalio Gutierrez's home. You'll hear Sadie Beecham indicate that also during this time period in April, she finds Olivia to have a phone she didn't know that she had. She looks in the phone. She discovers and knows that it's the defendant, one of the multiple phones the defendant utilizes. And you'll hear both Sadie and Olivia describe multiple phones. The defendant has a phone that he uses primarily, but he has a couple of other phones, one in particular used to record. She's looking at one of those phones, and she sees the defendant has ordered 2 tracking devices from Amazon. They are auto-tracking devices you attach to a vehicle, and that are voice-activated recorders as well. So they have dual purpose for spying missions. Electronics to help you spy. So by now, Sadie has heard from her daughter that there was this invasion of her privacy on April 24th. She knows trackers have been purchased by the defendant. She knows through a number of texts how jealous and irrational he is regarding her beginnings of a new relationship. He is describing Rosalio Gutierrez as beaner, booger, using all sorts of abusive names and terminology for him. On May 8th, Sadie again does not have the children with her, and she is going to Rosalio's home. And based on the suspicions of what I've talked about that have occurred in the last couple weeks, she thinks to herself at some point, you know what? He's probably tracking me. And so she searches her car, and she finds hidden under the car seat of one of the twins a phone that she knows belongs to the defendant, and it's on, meaning it would track her location. On May 8th, she drives to Kenosha. She turns that phone off. There's then a controversy between her and the defendant where he says, well, I just lost that phone. That phone must have toppled out of my pocket when I was working the car seat for one of the twins. Well, we know from looking into the electronics that he was using that phone and using an app he had just loaded on his phone recently, Find My Phone, to track her that very day. And so the things he told her about the circumstances were simply untrue. Instead, we know it was an app that he was using on that phone, connected to that phone, to figure out just where she would go on May 8th. Every time she brings this up, he acts like she's crazy. He acts like all the facts are false. But when you go into the electronics, when you go into his actual phone or computer, when you talk to Olivia, all the things she suspected and thought are actually true. The defendant is again and again fundamentally dishonest with her, acting as if these are all in her head or are accidents. Let's talk about the continuing escalation that this pattern that I've described shows. On May 13th, Sadie again does not have the children. Again, as a consulting adult, she decides to go down to visit Rosalio at his home address in Kenosha. Now, I want you to understand what we've talked about. April 24th, May 8th, and now May 13th. Because we are talking about just weeks, just days, before Rosalio Gutierrez at this same location is never again seen by those who love him, is essentially dead to those who love him. So now May 13th, we're 4 days away from that fateful day. On May 13th, Sadie goes down to Rosalio's. She is going down for food and to watch some movies. On the phone of the defendant, when taken into custody, on that phone, we have in the phone recordings of directions that look like GPS-type directions, which direct you. They are deleted, but they are recovered. We don't have every one of them, but the pattern of them gets you to Rosalio's address. This is the defendant's phone that is traveling per those directions that were deleted to Rosalio's home on the same date Sadie has gone down there. Now, Sadie is in Rosalio's home. And I want you to picture this, that this is what the evidence will be. Sadie is having one of those conversations you have as you start your meal and you're sitting down to watch something on TV. Rosalio says something specific to her about, do you want to watch this or something else? Conversations that many of you have had hundreds of times in your life as you begin to start your meal. Suddenly, right after it comes from the lips of Rosalio Gutierrez, she receives a text on her phone. The text is from the defendant. And the text is an exact quote of what Rosalio just said to her. It's an exact quote that he's just texted her. Now, he tells her later, oh, that's an accident. I didn't mean to text you. That was just an accident. But his phone, at that moment in time, is going off a Kenosha tower, not a tower by his home in the Mequon, a Kenosha tower, and it's the tower closest to where Rosalio Gutierrez lives. So not only do the directions get him there, and by the way, have him arriving at the right time, but his phone places him at that location, quoting what is being said inside Rosalio's apartment. I must be in control. Every gesture has the same pattern. I must be in control. By the next day, May 14th, we are now literally 3 days from Rosalio Gutierrez being dead to everyone who knows him. May 14th, the defendant now is looking for a confrontation based on his text messages to Sadie. May 14th, 4:13 p.m. You want me to stop by to meet Junior tonight? 4:41 p.m., half hour later. Still not off this topic. So, you're saying I can stop by and meet someone later. Now, none of Sadie's communications are inviting him over, let's make peace, let's talk, why don't you come on over, why don't you two meet? This is the defendant attempting to provoke, but revealing his intentions. This is a communication suggesting, I am looking for a confrontation. Here's what Olivia says about the period we've talked about so far. She says, every time I and the twins come over, this is the daughter, I apologize, this is the daughter, age 12. Every time we come over, he leaves and goes to follow mom. Every time we kids come over. She says to law enforcement, I am his spy about mom. I did it to please him. Here's a plan that she describes, age 12, to law enforcement that the defendant has cooked up and convinced her to be ready to implement. A spy operation. You ready? The 12-year-old says, on an occasion where I and the kids are brought to my dad's house because it's a visit, and where I know that my mom is going over to Rosalio's home, the plan is I will call my dad and that my dad will drive us kids back to mom's house, which of course would be unoccupied, right? Because Sadie would have gone to Rosalio's home. So my dad will drive us back to the unoccupied house. It's important I keep a key so that I can get in even though mom's not there. I and the twins will go into the house, and then I will call my dad and tell my dad, even though he's just dropped me off, hey, mom abandoned us and left us alone. This is the 12-year-old telling law enforcement that this is the plan that the defendant devised for her, his spy. And she said, at that point, my dad would report this. He would report that my mom had left us abandoned. That is the lengths that we're willing to go to get control, to end this relationship. They call it the plan. It's discussed multiple times. Now, on May 16th, 2020, one day before Rosalio Gutierrez is never again seen by those who love him, May 16th. Remember, I told you on May 17th how full of hope Sadie was. Well, here's why. On the 16th of May, Sadie gets a communication from Rosalio saying to her, would you like to come meet my kids? Rosalio has a boy, 11, and a girl, 8. They're at his house for the weekend on the 15th and 16th, and she's being invited for the first time to meet his kids. And they go for ice cream. And I think Sadie will tell you that this is a truly meaningful moment in her life, still today when she thinks about it. Those few hours she spent with those kids and Rosalio. She left for the night. She didn't spend the night. It was the last time she ever saw Rosalio Gutierrez. But it meant something to her because it's not an exclusive relationship, but it felt like her hopes that this relationship was going to build and get bigger and get better and maybe be the relationship for her. It felt like this really mattered. Here's how the defendant was handling that same visit. Her to lay down with some Down syndrome Mexican version of your father. That's a text from the defendant to Sadie trying to impose himself in this real moment in her life. He's texting spy Stephen Lenz, who lives just close enough to Sadie that he can see if cars are in her driveway, so he's a good lookout, right? He's a good lookout post. This is the defendant to Stephen Lenz on May 16th, asking if she has a car in her driveway. Remember, she doesn't have the kids. So whether a car's in her driveway or not is frankly none of his business. But his spy is being employed at that moment. So on the 17th of May, that's the day after this big moment where Sadie met his kids, And Sadie has said throughout this case that it feels like the defendant is some way monitoring all her communications. Everything that she's communicating with Rosalio feels like the defendant seems to somehow know it in real time. And no one knows how that happened. That's how it is. So at 1:52 p.m., this is literally 8 hours before Rosalio Gutierrez is gone and dead to everyone who knows him. 1:52 p.m., Sadie texts Rosalio. Sadie says to him in the text, "I want to be yours and get more serious with our relationship." Okay, that's how she felt after she met his kids. That's her putting herself out there, right? Not an exclusive relationship, but here it is. So there's some text back and forth. Rosalio calls her at 8:30 p.m. that night. This is an hour and a half before he's never seen again. And she misses that call. His last text to her is at 8:36 p.m., his phone to her phone. She never hears from him again. She tries him on the 18th of May. This is a relationship where they are in communication in some way, shape, or form several times a day during this period of time. On the 18th, absolutely no communication from him. On the 19th in the morning, still absolutely no communication from him. And so finally, she jumps in her car and she drives from the Milwaukee area on that morning. What is going on? Trying to figure out what's happening. And she gets to his home in Kenosha. And she finds that the sliding door is open. You'll see in the pictures, Rosalio Gutierrez has that apartment in an apartment complex that's the bottom floor, and his slider and his screen face right onto the road. So the sliding door is open, the screen is closed, and she looks in, and boy, does she see a lot of blood. And she calls 911. And at the moment she calls 911 and law enforcement gets there, there will be a number of things that law enforcement focus on in their investigation. And I'd ask you to think about these areas of focus as you think about the evidence as it comes in this case. One area of focus is, when was Rosalio Gutierrez last alive to those people who know him? The second area of investigation is, who has the motive and who has any pattern of conduct where they would be a person we should look to as a person who might have finished that pattern, completed that pattern, or acted on their motive and ended Rosalio Gutierrez's life. And then the third, of course, area of investigation was, where is the body of Rosalio Gutierrez? And I'm not going to belabor that in this opening. You'll hear about very substantial efforts in many jurisdictions involving many agencies to look for the body of Rosalio Gutierrez, which is never found. So on May 19th, okay, so this is 2 days after Rosalio has last been heard from, at 11:07 a.m., the Kenosha Police Department is at Rosalio's address. And they find through their investigation before too long that the last person in touch with him appears to be a woman whose last name is Macias, who received a text from him at 9:27 p.m. on the 17th, okay? And then she texted him back because she arrived at a building she thought was his. Turns out she was at the wrong building, but she thought she was at his building, and she calls him and texts him multiple times over the next half hour. Where are you? She'd never been here before. Are you coming out? You know, that kind of stuff. And there's never again an answer. So sometime after 9:27 p.m., the state's going to suggest to you all that blood results, and Rosalio Gutierrez is no more to those who know him. They go through family and friends, and no one has heard from him since that 9:27 p.m. time on May 17th through any other method of communication. And so law enforcement focuses on Sadie Beecham. Remember, she called 911. She's still at the scene. She is distraught. She's shaking. She's overcome. And she's really focused. Members of the jury, you'll hear the officer testify. She's really focused on getting her kids safe. She's afraid that the defendant has done this and that her kids might not be safe because of what she sees. And so she is allowed to prioritize that, and then this investigation, of course, continues. Rosalio's vehicles are still at the residence. His keys are there. There is a large amount of blood all over his residence in several rooms. The outer hallway, including outer hallway in a way, suggests that door opening into the hallway was open at a time when significant bleeding happened, including sprayed blood that looks like it's impact type of blood. There's blood then right inside the door, as if someone is now in the apartment and they are continuing to have some sort of intervention or attack happen where their blood is spraying. That blood is all over that now closed door on that interior. It is all over the rug area there and on the walls and on the tables. It extends to the dining room table. It extends to the chairs on the dining room table. Some of it hits the laptop. Some of it is in the kitchen counter. Some of it is pooled blood throughout that area where you are first in the entrance. There is a small stick of processed wood, like a baseball bat or some other hard object. It's not a log. It's not a piece of cut timber. That piece of wood ends up having blood on it, which is found to be the blood of Rosalio Gutierrez, and hair on it as well, which is also found to be Rosalio Gutierrez. There is significant blood on the curtains, which are on the entire other end of the apartment from where that entrance to the hallway comes.